We're starting a new sermon series today. It'll take us for about 3 weeks and lead us up towards the end of the month. And before we get started with that, I want to just invite you to consider some of the stories that you probably heard about before, which were rags to riches stories. Some of those stories are part of just sort of American folklore. Other people's stories that has happened to have become very well known. Sometimes those stories that start off like the more humble or disadvantaged the beginning, the greater that story seems to be, right? And some of you have neighbors or friends. Maybe this is some of your own stories or your family stories. But oftentimes we really celebrate those stories of people coming to this country, having nothing, and then really becoming quite successful for themselves and having resources and money that could be even shared throughout generations of that family over time. I know that some of these stories come to mind when we think about some of the people who are leaders of some of our biggest companies today, or people who have invented incredible products. I was reminded of the story of Oprah Winfrey this week, who grew up poor in rural Mississippi, and look where she is today. Those kinds of stories. What we don't talk about as often is the rags to riches to rags stories. We know that those stories exist too. The people who had so much and then lost it all. And maybe it was with a bad bounce in the stock market, or maybe it was a series of poor choices, or maybe it was just lavish spending and over the top lifestyle. But we see that go up and then down just as quickly. Interestingly, what we don't usually think about is that there is a story like that in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. A rags to riches to rags story, although maybe told a little bit differently. Let me remind you of it, and Amanda sort of set it up with the kids. So you may remember that in the book of Genesis, there is a patriarch in the church, or not in the church, but in the early story of the Hebrew people named Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons. And you may remember the story about his favorite son, Joseph, who he gives this fancy coat to, and he gets preferential treatment, and the brothers hate that he gets his father's attention and affection. And so they sell him into slavery. Joseph ends up on this caravan where he gets transported down to Egypt. Through a series of events, he gets put in prison, and then he can interpret dreams, and so he interprets the Pharaoh's dreams, and he becomes sort of the right-hand man to the Pharaoh. Part of what happens to get him into this position that he's in with the Pharaoh is that he interprets a vision that the Pharaoh has that says that there will be years of plenty followed by years of famine. And so they are able to store up resources, and then when the famine comes, they're in good shape. The rags to riches part is that Joseph's extended family, meanwhile, up north, is suffering with famine. And he invites his brothers and his father and their extended family and their whole clan to come down to Egypt, and they go from starvation and famine and rags to the riches and the spoils of ancient Egypt and all of its splendor at this incredible time in Egypt's history. But then what happens, we don't exactly know. The story jumps ahead, but something happens. Maybe it was enough time had passed, generations had gone by, maybe there was some different events, maybe it was some outside influence or outside forces that came in and attacked and asserted themselves in Egypt, but for whatever reason, enough time had passed where people forgot the name of Joseph. And he was no longer a big deal. And now his extended family and their progeny are existing in this land, but they have been enslaved by the population of the Egyptians. And so they're back to rags again. It was the lowest to the highest to the lowest again. And then we end up hearing the story of Moses, the one that God calls to deliver the people out of the hand of Pharaoh, out of Egypt, into the Sinai desert and wilderness, where they are now to wander for 40 years. And that's where we get the setup for that story that I just read. So the Israelites, they've been enslaved. Now they are free. And it takes them 2.5 months before they say, can we go back? Can we go back to what it was like? Because at least when we were in Egypt, we know we were guaranteed a meal. It wasn't much, but we had enough to live on. Sustenance, basic needs were being provided for. It was terrible, it was grueling, it was no real life to speak of, and yet we had that cared for. God hears their grumbling. And I've always been a little bit critical, I guess, of the Israelites in this situation. I think, you've been liberated. You've been freed. This miraculous thing has happened, the Passover event, the parting of the sea. You've been given this guide and Moses that you can trust in, who has this direct line of communication to God, and you will go into the wilderness, and it takes you like 75 days, maybe less, before you start fussing about the circumstances. And yet, it's pretty ignorant of me to do that because I have never experienced borderline starvation before. And I can only imagine that it only takes days, not weeks, before that kind of desperation sits in. And we all have heard stories of people who become so desperate in times of starvation that they would do nearly anything. And so these Israelites are wandering in the desert. They begin to grumble, and God hears them and responds. And he says, I'm going to give you this gift. Every night, the quail are going to fly in, they're going to land on the ground, and these are not bright birds. You are going to be able to capture all that you want, and you will be able to get meat from them. And in the morning, you will receive your daily bread, and it will be like frost covering the ground. You just gather it up. An omer for each person. Now, I don't know how much an omer is, but let's just say that's daily bread's worth. And everybody has an omer, and if you didn't quite gather enough, because if somebody told you to gather half a pound of something in your hand, you could probably get close-ish, but it would be a little under, it would be a little over. But after everybody gathered everything, everybody had just the right amount. There was enough to go around. Now, I wonder about this story, and I wonder, what was God's motivation for doing this? Why the manna? Why not food in more conventional ways? I've wondered, is it maybe because if the people began to plant crops, harvested seeds, plant them and tend to them, would they become too attached to the land? If you work the land, you tend to become attached to that land. I've known people who grew up in family farms, and the idea of ever giving up that family farm is almost unimaginable. That's our land. We've worked that land. We put so much effort into that land. Was there a fear that they'd become attached to that when they were really destined to go on to the promised land after this? Maybe that's it. Maybe it was for other reasons. Maybe if they stayed around and tried to work the land, that they couldn't be mobile, and they were meant to be continuing to move on and go and go. They were supposed to spend 40 years working on this process of moving from place to place, and they were going to solidify their identity as a people. They were going to grow closer together. They were going to live for 40 years so that a generation would pass, so that this mindset of moving from this slavery mindset into a freedom mindset would be able to take place. And if they had to stick into one place and work the land and other conventional means, would they not be as mobile and able to migrate from place to place? But really, I think that the answer is much more simple, and honestly, the Bible spells it out for us. God said, I'm going to provide this manna because I want the people to know that I will provide for them and that they will need to depend on me. Pure and simple. Now, I would put this into, I guess, what I want to start calling God lessons. And God lessons are all of those things like we talk about so often in worship, which are these lessons that make perfect sense, are right there for the taking, and it's so difficult to follow. So a God lesson is trust in me, depend on me. That's it. It's so hard to do. When the Israelites are given the opportunity with this manna, and Moses says to them, hey, God said it's going to be there every single morning. The birds every night, the manna every morning. you will be able to collect enough for you for that day and for those who reside in your tent. No more, no less. And what is the first thing that they do? They try to gather more than an omer's worth. Hey, it's here for the taking. Scoop it all up as much as possible. It doesn't take one time before hoarding mentality sets in. Get it while it's free. Scoop up all you can. It's a finite resource. It's going to be gone immediately. Take all you can. And God knows this, and it turns into worms and decays and is inedible and useless right out of the gate. Because that's not what the point was. Now, we could blame this on sort of a scarcity mindset that comes with people living for generations as slaves. They've had nothing, and now everything that they could eat is before them. You could hardly blame them for scooping it up. And yet, this is something we all struggle with. There is not one time that I have gone through a buffet and done it responsibly. It's there for the taking. Scoop it up. You hoarded toilet paper and Lysol wipes in 2020. Because if you found it, you bought all you could. And in the early part of that year, you hoarded N95 masks if you could get your hands on them. Right? And it wasn't that you didn't want other people to have them, you just wanted to make sure that you had enough. I'm just saying, before we point our fingers at the Israelites, let's remember that ours were cleaned by Lysol wipes, right? So we have a tendency to do this. We fall into this trap all the time. And it took not one day of manna before the Israelites fell into this. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about stewardship. This is our annual stewardship campaign. And we're going to be focusing again on this chapter in Exodus, the 16th chapter, which is this story of manna. Because I believe that there are a number of lessons that come out of this passage. And the first one is about understanding the idea that God provides. And that God provides enough, especially when we are generous. And I don't mean that in terms of like give away more because you'll get more. This is not a prosperity gospel type of thing. But the idea that God has given us resources that when we are able to account for that which we need, and I don't think it's wrong to save a little something extra, but when we go over the top and we begin to pull in and it's a big grab and we take in all that we can, that's when things get a little bit out of control. One, we become very much self-reliant and start to think that we don't depend on God anymore. Two, we begin to hoard resources that we could be sharing with other people. And three, we forget that these gifts are by nature a gift from God. So I think that there are messages and I think that there are lessons in this passage for us that we can take to heart. The Israelites are going to experience this manna for 40 years. And I think that their complaint, as we know, is going to turn different, like this manna stuff is starting to taste repetitive. I feel like we're eating the same thing over and over again. But maybe it's going to take 40 years of having that handed to them and even distribution and making sure that everybody has enough and caring for everybody in your tent and enough for everybody in the community to set the tone for when they actually do enter into the promised land 40 years later. Hopefully they will have learned the lesson that as they enter this land of plenty, that there will be enough. Jesus has his own version of this story in the story of the loaves and the fishes, where one child's generosity ends up becoming enough. And if everybody was worried about taking more than their fair share of what was in the basket as it went around, there may not have been enough, but everybody realized that we're in this together. So again, this isn't a sermon about socialism. This isn't about an even distribution of everything. But I am going to make it clear to you when I say that when we have what we need, and we've saved some for emergency situations or retirements or special things, that there is often some that we need to be including in terms of giving to others. We give generously. We give away. We share the resources. We share the wealth. We share with those in need. We share with special causes. We share because there is a disaster or a circumstance that requires our assistance. And we share with our church because God asks us to. So I want to encourage you to be thinking about that. What are the attitudes that we have around enough, around plenty? Do we fall into that natural human trap time after time of wanting to gather in more, or do we ever actually arrive at a place where we feel like, this is good, this feels reasonable, this feels like a blessing, rather than this is what I deserve? And when we begin to adapt this kind of mindset and this way of thinking, I believe that our priorities will be in a better order, and it will be the kind of lessons that God tried to teach the Israelites and that we have struggled with ever since. What does it look like to have enough? What does it look like to make sure all mouths are fed? And what does it look like to share what we have with others? Will you pray with me?